The wagon didn't even slow down. It just kept rolling, wheels crunching over dry earth, leaving Ruth Callahan standing in the middle of nowhere with a carpet bag, and the sudden gut punch realization that she'd been thrown away like spoiled meat. 52 years old, 2,000 miles from anything she knew. And the man who was supposed to marry her, the man whose letters promised a home, a life, something worth the journey, had taken one look at her and decided she wasn't worth the ink he'd wasted. Now night was coming. The town behind her was all sharp edges and hostile stares. No boarding house would take a woman alone. No store would extend credit to someone with empty pockets. And somewhere in the growing dark, Ruth understood something that made her hands shake. She was about to find out exactly how much a woman's life was worth when no one was looking. Before we go any further, if you're watching this, drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far Ruth's story travels. And hit that like button, because this one gets rough before it gets real. The frontier didn't care about your story. It didn't care that Ruth Callahan had sold everything she owned in Philadelphia. The boarding house her mother left her, the furniture, the good china, even the silver hairbrush that had been in the family for 3 generations. It didn't care that she'd spent 6 weeks in a wagon train with people who looked at her like she was already a ghost. A woman too old to be starting over, too worn to be worth the trouble. The frontier just took what it wanted and left the rest to rot. Ruth stood there in the settling dust, her carpet bag at her feet, watching the wagon disappear down the rutted road. The driver hadn't even helped her down, just jerked his thumb toward the general store and said, "Man you're looking for is inside. Good luck, lady." The way he said it, like he already knew how this was going to go. She'd straightened her dress, fixed her hat, told herself that Samuel Pritchard's letters had been kind, thoughtful even. He'd written about his farm, about needing a partner to share the work and the years ahead. He'd never mentioned love, but he'd mentioned respect. And at 52, Ruth had learned that respect was rare and more valuable than passion. The store was dim inside, smelling of tobacco and leather and something sour she couldn't place. 3 men stood near the counter. She knew immediately which one was Samuel, tall, maybe 60, with a beard going white and eyes that didn't quite meet hers. "Mr. Pritchard?" He looked at her for a long moment. Too long. Then he turned to the man beside him and said, "This is what 4 months of letters gets you, Carl. A woman old enough to be a grandmother." The other man snorted. Ruth felt something crack open inside her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "Your letters didn't mention age requirements." "My letters," Samuel said slowly, "were written when I was drunk enough to think any woman was better than none. I've since reconsidered." The third man, younger, looked uncomfortable. "Sam, maybe nothing." Samuel pulled a few bills from his pocket and slapped them on the counter. "This covers her wagon fare back east. Tell Hennessy to take her to Carson City. She can catch a train from there." Ruth stared at the money. $17. Not enough to get her back to Philadelphia. Not enough to start over anywhere else. Not enough to matter. "I sold my house," she said quietly. "Not my problem." "I have nowhere to go." Samuel was already walking toward the door. "Should have thought of that before you got old, lady." The door banged shut. The younger man grabbed the bills and shoved them toward Ruth. "Look, I'm sorry, but keep it." Ruth's voice came out harder than she intended. "Give it to the next woman he tricks into crossing the country." She picked up her bag and walked out into the failing light. The town was called Salvation Point, which struck Ruth as the kind of bitter joke the frontier specialized in. 1 main street, maybe 40 buildings, half of them looking like a strong wind would take them down. Salvation Point had a saloon, a livery, a general store, and the kind of desperate, mean energy that came from people trying to scratch a living out of ground that didn't want to give it. Ruth walked the length of the street twice, looking for options. The boarding house had a full sign in the window that looked permanent. The saloon had women working, but they were young and hard-eyed, and Ruth knew better than to ask. The general store owner took one look at her and said, "No credit, no charity, no exceptions." By the time the sun started dropping behind the hills, Ruth was sitting on a bench outside the livery, trying to figure out how a person died of being unwanted. Did you just sit down and wait? Did it happen fast or slow? "You're the mail order woman." Ruth looked up. The speaker was a man in his 30s, dusty and lean, with a face that suggested he'd stopped finding things funny a long time ago. I was, Ruth said. Heard Pritchard sent you packing. That true? Seems to be. The man studied her for a moment. You got a place to sleep? Not yet. You got money? Ruth almost laughed. Not enough to matter. He nodded, like this was about what he expected. There's a ranch about 8 miles north, Black Hollow. They're always short on help. Kitchen work, mostly. Cleaning, cooking, mending. Pays not much, but it comes with a bunk and meals. Why are you telling me this? Because Salvation Point's not kind to people with nowhere to go. Especially women, especially at night. He paused. Black Hollow's not kind either, but at least it's honest about it. Ruth stood up, her back aching from the bench. How do I get there? You don't, not tonight. Road's not safe in the dark, but if you're still alive in the morning, I'll take you. He tipped his hat. Name's Webb. I run freight between here and the ranch. Ruth Callahan. I know. Whole town knows. Small place, bad news travels fast. He turned to go, then stopped. One more thing. Black Hollow's run by a man named Ethan Crow. He's fair mostly, but he doesn't suffer weakness. You go out there, you better be ready to work harder than you've ever worked in your life. And even then, he might send you back. Why? Because that's what he does. Ranch eats people. Crow figures if you can't handle it, better to find out fast. Ruth picked up her carpet bag. Where can I sleep tonight? Webb looked uncomfortable. Livery's got a loft. Owner's not keen on it, but if you're quiet and gone by dawn, he probably won't shoot you. Probably? Best I can do. The loft smelled like hay and horse piss and old leather. Ruth climbed the ladder with her bag, found a corner that looked less filthy than the rest, and sat down with her back against the wall. Below, she could hear the horses shifting in their stalls. Somewhere in town, a piano was playing badly. A woman laughed, high and sharp. Men's voices rose and fell. Ruth pulled her shawl tight and tried not to think about Philadelphia. About the boarding house with its neat rooms and regular tenants. About Sunday dinners and the garden out back. About the life she'd walked away from because it felt small and finished. Because Samuel Pritchard's letters had promised something bigger. She'd been a fool. That much was clear. But sitting here in the dark, listening to a town that didn't want her, Ruth understood something else. She was done being discarded. If Black Hollow Ranch wanted to break her, it was welcome to try. She didn't sleep. Couldn't. Every sound made her flinch. Footsteps, voices, the creak of the building settling. At some point, someone came into the livery, and Ruth held her breath until they left. When the sky started turning gray, she climbed down, brushed the hay from her dress, and waited outside. Webb showed up just after dawn with a wagon and 2 horses that looked about as tired as Ruth felt. You still set on this? He asked. I don't see another option. There's always another option. You just might not like it. Ruth climbed onto the wagon bench. I already don't like this one. Let's go. The road north was rough, cutting through country that looked like something had given up on it halfway through creation. Scrub brush, rocks, dust that got into everything. The hills in the distance were brown and bare, and the sky was the kind of pale blue that promised heat later. Webb didn't talk much. Ruth was grateful for that. She watched the landscape roll past and tried to prepare herself for whatever was coming. What's he like? She asked finally. Crow. Webb took his time answering. Depends on the day. He's not cruel, if that's what you're asking, but he's not kind either. Lost his wife and kid about 5 years back. Fever took them both in the same week. He hasn't been the same since. What was he like before? Different. Friendlier, I guess. Now he just works. Dawn to dark, sometimes longer. Expects everyone else to do the same. And if they don't, he sends them down the road. Ruth absorbed this. How many people has he sent away? More than he's kept. The ranch appeared just before midday, a collection of low buildings scattered across a hollow in the hills. There was a main house, a bunkhouse, a barn, a few outbuildings that looked like they were held together by habit and stubbornness, corrals with horses, a vegetable garden that had seen better days. And everywhere, dust, like the land was trying to reclaim the whole operation one handful at a time. Webb pulled the wagon up to the main house and set the brake. Wait here. He disappeared inside. Ruth sat on the bench, feeling the sun beat down on her hat, feeling eyes on her from the bunkhouse. Two men stood in the doorway, watching. A third was working near the barn, but he'd stopped to stare. The door opened. Webb came out, followed by a man who had to be Ethan Crow. He was maybe 45, tall and spare, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to relax. He wore work clothes, dusty pants, a shirt with the sleeves rolled up, boots that had seen 1,000 miles. His eyes were the color of creek water, and they didn't miss anything. He looked at Ruth the way you'd look at a horse you weren't sure was worth buying. "You're the woman from Salvation Point?" "Ruth Callahan." "Webb says you need work." "That's right." Crow walked closer, studying her. Ruth forced herself to meet his eyes, even though everything in her wanted to look away. "How old are you?" "Old enough to know better, young enough to work hard." One of the men by the bunkhouse laughed. Crow didn't. "You ever worked a ranch?" "No." "Ever cooked for 15 men?" "I ran a boarding house in Philadelphia. I cooked for 12 tenants, 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, for 18 years. "This isn't Philadelphia." "I noticed?" Crow almost smiled. Almost. "Kitchen work's brutal. Early mornings, late nights, no breaks. Men here work hard, and they eat like it. You fall behind, you don't get a second chance. Understood?" "Understood." "Pays $5 a month plus room and board. You get a bunk in the back room off the kitchen. Sundays you get the afternoon off, but that's it. You want to leave, you give me a day's notice. I want you gone, you get the same." Ruth nodded. "When do I start?" "Now. Dinner's at 6. You'll find what you need in the kitchen. Current cook left 3 days ago, so things are a mess. Get it sorted." He turned and walked away. Webb gave Ruth a look that might have been sympathy. "Welcome to Black Hollow." The kitchen was worse than a mess. It was a disaster. Dirty pots stacked in the sink. A stove that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the previous century. Flour and cornmeal spilled across the counter. A barrel of potatoes going soft in the corner. The whole room smelled like grease and smoke and neglect. Ruth set her carpet bag down and looked around. 18 years running a boarding house had taught her that panic was useless. You assessed the situation, made a plan, and started working. Falling apart could wait. She found an apron hanging on a nail, tied it on, and got to work. First, clean water. She found the pump outside, filled a bucket, hauled it back. Then another. Then a kettle for the stove. Second, fire. The stove was stubborn, but Ruth had fought worse. She got it lit, got the water heating, started scrubbing pots. Third, inventory. She opened cupboards and crates, taking stock. There was food, beans, cornmeal, dried beef, lard, coffee, a few sad onions. Not much, but enough. By the time the men started drifting in for dinner, Ruth had managed to produce something that resembled food. Beans with onions, cornbread, coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot, and there was enough of it. The men filed in and sat at the long table without speaking. 15 of them, all told, ranging from boys barely old enough to shave to men with gray in their beards. They looked at Ruth with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism to outright hostility. Crow sat at the head of the table. He didn't introduce her, didn't explain. Just said, "This is Ruth. She's the new cook." One of the men, big with a scar across his jaw, grunted. "Where's the last one?" "Gone," Crow said. "Eat." They ate. Ruth watched from the kitchen doorway, waiting for complaints. They came fast. "Cornbread's dry." "Beans ain't seasoned." "Coffee tastes like mud." Ruth said nothing. She collected the empty plates, scraped them, started washing. When the men cleared out, Crow stayed behind. He stood in the doorway, watching her work. "It wasn't good," he said finally. "I know. But it was food, and it was ready on time. That's something." Ruth scrubbed a pot. "I'll do better tomorrow." "You'll have to." He paused. "Your room's through that door. There's a bed and a trunk. Water in the pitcher. Outhouse is behind the main building." "Thank you." He nodded and left. Ruth finished the dishes, wiped down the counter, banked the stove. Then she went to her room. It was small, barely bigger than a closet. A narrow bed with a thin mattress. A trunk. A window so dirty she could barely see through it. But it was a room. It was hers. And after last night in the livery loft, it felt like a palace. She sat on the bed and let herself shake. The first week almost killed her. Ruth woke every morning at 4:30, built the fire, started the coffee, mixed biscuits or cornbread, fried bacon or salt pork, made enough food to fuel 15 men through a day of back-breaking labor. Then she cleaned the kitchen, washed the clothes, mended what needed mending, started on dinner, then supper, then cleanup. By the time she fell into bed, it was usually past 10, and her hands were raw and her back screamed. The men didn't make it easier. They complained constantly. The food was too bland, too salty, too dry, too burnt. The coffee was too weak, too strong, too bitter. She was too slow. She didn't know what she was doing. She didn't belong here. The worst was a man named Harlan, the big one with the scar. He seemed to take personal offense to Ruth's existence. "Back in Texas," he said loudly one night, "we had a cook who could make a steak sing. This woman can't even make beans edible." The others laughed. Ruth kept serving. "Maybe she's too old," Harlan continued. "Maybe her taste buds died." More laughter. Crow, sitting at the head of the table, didn't say anything. Ruth wanted him to tell Harlan to shut up, but Crow just ate his food and stared out the window. Ruth learned fast. She was on her own here, so she adapted. She watched the men, learned what they liked. Harlan wanted his coffee strong enough to strip paint. A kid named Tommy liked extra bacon. An older man called Dutch wouldn't eat onions. She started adjusting, making small changes. She also started getting up earlier, 4 o'clock instead of 4:30, then 3:30. She discovered that if she got the bread started before anyone else was awake, it turned out better. If she let the beans simmer longer, they got tender. Slowly, painfully slowly, the complaints started to ease. Not from Harlan. He was determined to hate her. But some of the others began to nod when she served them. A few even said thanks. On her first Sunday afternoon off, Ruth washed her hair, mended her dress, and walked the property. She wanted to see what she'd gotten herself into. Black Hollow was bigger than it looked from the road. Maybe 300 acres of hard ground, with the ranch buildings in the hollow and the grazing land spreading out toward the hills. There were cattle, not many, but enough. Horses in the corrals, chickens scratching near the barn, and everywhere, work. Fences to mend, buildings to repair, land to clear. Ruth found Crow near the barn, fixing a wagon wheel. He didn't look up when she approached. "Something you need? Just looking around? See anything interesting?" "I see a lot of work. That's all there is out here." Ruth watched him work for a moment. His hands were scarred and capable, moving with the kind of precision that came from doing the same task 1,000 times. "Why did you let me stay?" she asked. Crow paused, then went back to the wheel. "You showed up. You worked. That's all I ask." "Harlan doesn't think I should be here." "Harlan doesn't think much of anything. Don't worry about him. He makes it difficult." "Life's difficult. You get used to it or you don't." Ruth nodded slowly. "And if I don't?" Crow looked at her then, really looked at her. "Then you leave, like all the others." "How many others?" "Enough." He turned back to the wheel. "Enjoy your afternoon, Mrs. Callahan." Ruth walked back to the kitchen, thinking about that answer. Enough. Like people were water, flowing through the ranch and disappearing. She didn't plan to disappear. The second week was worse than the first. One of the men, a quiet guy named Sam, got kicked by a horse and broke his arm. Crow said it, but Sam was out of commission, which meant everyone else had to work harder. Tempers got short, the complaints got louder. And then Ruth burned the biscuits. She didn't mean to. She'd gotten distracted cleaning the stove, lost track of time, and by the time she remembered, the whole batch was black on the bottom. The men let her know about it. "What the hell is this? Thought we were eating food, not charcoal. Jesus, woman, how hard is it to watch a damn oven?" Ruth scraped the burnt parts off, served them anyway. Most of the men ate them without comment, but Harlan made a show of pushing his plate away. "I ain't eating this garbage." Crow, at the end of the table, said quietly, "Then don't. We're paying her to cook. She should cook." "She is cooking. You don't like it. You're welcome to do it yourself." Harlan's face went red. "Maybe I will. Kitchen's open. Go ahead." The room went silent. Harlan stared at Crow, then at Ruth, then back at Crow. Finally, he shoved back from the table and walked out, slamming the door behind him. The other men went back to eating. Ruth felt something loosen in her chest. Not gratitude. Crow hadn't defended her exactly, but he'd shut Harlan down, and that was something. After dinner, she found Crow outside, smoking. "Thank you," she said. He shrugged. "Harlan's an ass. Somebody needed to tell him." Still, Crow studied her in the dim light. "You're tougher than you look, Mrs. Callahan." "I'm tougher than I feel." He almost smiled. "That's usually how it works." The third week, Ruth made her first real mistake. She'd been trying to expand the menu, make something other than beans and cornbread. She decided on stew, good hearty stew with beef and potatoes and carrots. The problem was the beef. It had been sitting in the cold room too long, and Ruth didn't notice until the stew was already cooking. By then, it was too late. Dinner that night was a disaster. 3 men got sick. 2 more complained of stomach cramps. Harlan threw his bowl across the room. "You trying to kill us?" Ruth felt her face burn. "I didn't. The meat." "You didn't check the damn meat." Crow stood up. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise like a knife. "Everyone out?" The men filed out, grumbling. Ruth stood by the stove, shaking. When they were gone, Crow turned to her. "What happened?" "The meat was bad. I should have checked it." "Yes, you should have." Ruth nodded. She waited for him to tell her to pack her things. Instead, he said, "Tomorrow, I'll show you how to tell if meat's turned. It's hard to see sometimes, but there are signs. You'll learn." Ruth looked up, startled. "You're not sending me away?" "For a mistake? No. For not learning from it? Maybe. But you will learn, won't you?" "Yes." "Then we're done here. Clean this mess up and get some sleep. Tomorrow starts early." He left. Ruth stood there for a long moment, feeling something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not hope, exactly. But maybe its cousin. The 4th week, Sam came back to work with his arm still in a sling. He couldn't do much, but he tried, and that meant something. Ruth made sure his portions were a little bigger, his coffee a little stronger. One morning, he stopped her in the kitchen. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for looking out for me." Ruth nodded. "You're working hard. Least I can do." "You're working harder. I see you, Mrs. Callahan. We all do." He walked out before she could respond. That afternoon, she found a bouquet of wildflowers on the kitchen counter. No note, but she knew they were from Sam. She put them in a jar and set them on the windowsill. By the end of the first month, Ruth had found a rhythm. She knew how much coffee to make, how to time the bread, which men liked what. She knew to save the crispiest bacon for Tommy, to leave the onions out of Dutch's plate, to make Harlan's coffee strong enough to wake the dead. She also knew which chores could wait and which couldn't. Knew when to push herself and when to rest. Knew the land, the weather, the way the light changed as the seasons shifted. Black Hollow was still brutal. The work was still endless. The men were still difficult. But Ruth was still here. And that, she was learning, was its own kind of victory. One evening, after the dinner dishes were done, Crow came into the kitchen and sat at the table. This was unusual. Normally, he ate and left. "Something wrong?" Ruth asked. "No, just thinking." She waited. "When you first got here," he said slowly, "I didn't think you'd last a week." "I didn't either." "But you did. And now it's been a month, and you're still here, still working." Ruth dried her hands on her apron. "Is there a point to this?" Crow looked at her, something like respect in his eyes. "Just this. You've earned your place here, Mrs. Callahan. I wanted you to know that." He stood and walked out. Ruth stood alone in the kitchen, feeling the weight of those words settle over her. You've earned your place here. In a life full of people telling her she wasn't enough, wasn't young enough, wasn't pretty enough, wasn't worth the trouble, those 6 words felt like a revelation. She hadn't just survived being abandoned. She'd proven she could be more than what people expected. And that was only the beginning. The second month started with a death. Not a person. A calf. Ruth found it in the morning when she went to get milk, lying in the pen with its eyes already clouded over. She'd never seen a dead animal up close before. Not like this. And for a moment she just stood there, unsure what to do. Tommy came around the corner and stopped. "Oh, hell. What happened to it?" "Hard to say. Could be anything out here. Sickness, snakebite, bad luck." He crouched down, examined the calf without touching it. "Crow's not going to be happy. This was one of the spring births. He had plans for it. Should I tell him?" "He'll find out soon enough. Always does." Tommy stood, wiped his hands on his pants. You okay? You look a little green. Ruth realized she was gripping the milk pail hard enough to hurt. I'm fine. First dead thing you've seen? First one that mattered, I suppose. Tommy gave her an odd look, then nodded toward the barn. Come on. There's another cow that's still producing. I'll show you. By the time Ruth got back to the kitchen, Crow was already dealing with the calf. She could see him through the window, dragging it toward the far end of the property where they burned things. His face was set in that expression she'd come to recognize. Not angry, exactly, but something harder. Like he was swallowing whatever he felt and locking it away. She started breakfast and didn't mention it. The men came in quieter than usual. Word had spread. On a ranch, death was common enough that it shouldn't matter, but it always did. Every loss was money, work, hope. All the things they couldn't afford to waste. Harlan, of course, had something to say. Bet it was the feed. We've been going through that grain too fast. Some of it's probably moldy. Dutch shook his head. Feed's fine. I checked it last week. Well, something killed it. Things die, Harlan. That's what they do. Not if you're paying attention. Crow walked in then, and the room went silent. He poured himself coffee, sat down, didn't look at anyone. It happens, he said quietly. We move on. Harlan opened his mouth, then closed it. Even he knew when to shut up. Ruth served the food. Bacon, eggs, biscuits that had actually turned out right this time. The men ate without complaint, and when they filed out, Crow lingered. You handled that well, he said. Ruth was scrubbing the skillet. Handled what? This morning, Tommy said you didn't panic. Panicking wouldn't have brought it back to life. Crow almost smiled. No, but most people still panic anyway. He left, and Ruth stood there thinking about Philadelphia, about the boarding house, where the worst emergency was a leaky pipe or a tenant who couldn't pay rent. She thought that life was hard. Now she understood it had just been complicated. Hard was different. Hard was watching something die and knowing there was nothing you could do except keep moving. The next week brought a different kind of trouble. Ruth was in the kitchen one afternoon, elbow deep in bread dough, when she heard shouting from the yard. She wiped her hands and went to the window. Two men were facing off near the barn. One of them was Sam, the other a ranch hand named Pete, who'd been here about 3 months. Sam's arm was out of the sling now, but it was still weak, and Pete was bigger, meaner, the kind of man who liked having an advantage. I'm telling you, I didn't touch your damn saddle, Sam was saying. Then where the hell is it? How should I know? Maybe you lost it. Pete shoved Sam backward. Sam stumbled, caught himself, but his bad arm hung useless at his side. Ruth was out the door before she thought about it. Hey! Her voice came out sharper than she intended. Both men turned. Whatever this is, take it somewhere else. I've got work to do and I don't need the noise. Pete looked at her like she'd grown a second head. This ain't your business, lady. You're doing it 10 feet from my kitchen. That makes it my business. Stay out of it. Or what? Ruth didn't know where the words were coming from, only that she was tired of men acting like fools. You'll shove me too? Go ahead. See how well that works out for you. Pete's face darkened. For a second, Ruth thought he might actually do it. Then Crow's voice cut through the tension. Problem here? Pete stepped back. No, boss, just a misunderstanding. Then go misunderstand somewhere else, both of you. Sam left immediately. Pete lingered just long enough to shoot Ruth a look that promised this wasn't over, then walked away. Crow waited until they were gone, then turned to Ruth. That was stupid. Probably. Pete's got a temper. You don't want to be on the wrong side of it. Seemed like Sam was already there. Somebody had to step in. That somebody doesn't have to be you. Ruth met his eyes. Who else was going to do it? You weren't here. The other men were working. Sam's got one good arm, and Pete's got a mean streak. You want me to just watch? Crow studied her for a long moment. You're not responsible for keeping the peace here, Mrs. Callahan. Maybe not, but I'm not going to stand by and watch someone get hurt for no good reason either. He nodded slowly. Fair enough. But next time, come get me first. If there's time. She went back to the kitchen, her hands shaking now that the moment had passed. Through the window, she saw Crow talking to Pete, his voice low and hard. Whatever he said, Pete didn't look happy about it. That night, Sam found Ruth after dinner. Thank you, he said quietly, for earlier. It was nothing. Wasn't nothing to me. Pete's been riding me for weeks. Thinks because my arm was busted, I'm useless. Ruth dried a plate. Are you useless? No, ma'am. Just slower than I was. Then prove him wrong. Best way to shut someone up is to make them irrelevant. Sam grinned. Yes, ma'am. After he left, Ruth found herself thinking about her own advice. Make them irrelevant. She'd been doing that, hadn't she? Every meal that didn't poison anyone, every morning she showed up before anyone else, every night she outlasted the complaints. She was making the doubters irrelevant. But there were still so many of them. The weather turned in late October. The temperature dropped fast, and the wind came howling down from the hills like it had a personal grudge. Ruth woke one morning to frost on the window and had to break ice in the water bucket. The men came in for breakfast looking haggard. Night work was harder in the cold, and tempers were already thin. Coffee's weak, Harlan announced. Ruth didn't even look up. Then drink it twice. A few of the men snorted. Harlan glared but didn't push it. Later, Dutch pulled Ruth aside. You're learning how to handle him. Am I? Better than most. Harlan's the kind of man who'll keep pushing until you push back. You're starting to push back. I'm just tired of listening to him complain. Dutch smiled. That's usually how it starts. The cold brought other problems. The stove ate through wood faster. The chickens stopped laying as much. The men needed more food to keep their energy up, which meant Ruth was working even longer hours. She started waking at 3 in the morning, sometimes earlier. She'd build the fire, get the coffee going, start the bread, and by the time the sun came up, she'd already been working for hours. Her hands cracked and bled from the cold and the work, but she wrapped them in cloth and kept going. One morning, Crow found her in the kitchen at 2:30, kneading dough by lamplight. You're up early. Ruth didn't stop working. Bread takes time. It's the middle of the night, I noticed. He poured himself coffee from the pot she'd started, leaned against the counter. You don't have to kill yourself over this, you know. I'm not killing myself. I'm just working. There's a difference? Ruth finally looked at him. Is there? You're up. I'm up. Everyone here works until they can't anymore. That's the deal, isn't it? Crow was quiet for a moment. I suppose it is. Then why are you questioning me doing the same thing you do? Because you're... He stopped. I'm what? A woman? Old? Not built for this? Ruth's hands stilled in the dough. I know what I am, Mr. Crow. I also know what I'm capable of. And right now, I'm capable of making bread at 2:30 in the morning because that's what needs doing. He set down his coffee. I wasn't going to say any of that. Then what were you going to say? That you're tougher than most of the men I've hired, and I was trying to figure out how that happened. Ruth started kneading again. It happened because I didn't have a choice, same as you. He nodded slowly, then left her to her work. November brought the first real test. One of the newer men, a kid named Danny, maybe 19, got thrown from his horse and landed wrong. By the time they got him back to the ranch, his leg was swelling and he was screaming. Crow set the brake in the main house while Ruth and Tommy held Danny down. The kid passed out halfway through, which was probably a mercy. He needs rest, Crow said, wiping blood from his hands. At least 2 weeks, maybe more. We're already short-handed, Tommy said. I know, we'll manage. But managing meant everyone else working harder, and the men were already stretched thin. Ruth started hearing complaints again, about the schedule, about the work, about everything. And then Pete's saddle turned up. It was in the barn, right where it should have been, covered by a tarp someone had thrown over it. Pete found it himself, which meant he couldn't blame anyone else without looking like an idiot. He looked like an idiot anyway. Must have missed it before, he muttered. Sam, standing nearby, didn't say anything, but Ruth saw the ghost of a smile on his face. That night, Pete didn't show up for dinner. Where is he? Ruth asked. Took his gear and left, Dutch said. Told Crow he was heading to Carson City. Better opportunities, he said. Harlan snorted. Better opportunities to avoid looking like a fool, more like. The men laughed, and Ruth served the food. One less person to cook for. One less mouth to feed. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt like the ranch had gotten a little smaller, a little more fragile. Danny recovered slowly. Ruth brought him food twice a day, changed his bandages, made sure he didn't do anything stupid. The kid was bored and frustrated, which made him snappish. I should be working. You should be healing. I'm fine. Your leg's broken. You're not fine. I've had worse. Ruth looked at him. I'm sure you have. But worse doesn't mean you're invincible. It just means you've been lucky. Danny scowled but didn't argue. By the second week, he was hobbling around on a crutch Tommy had made. By the third, he was trying to do light work. Ruth caught him trying to carry water buckets and took them away. What the hell, Mrs. Callahan? You tear that leg open again. Crow will have both our hides. Sit down. I can't just sit. You can and you will. There's a difference between tough and stupid, Danny. Learn it. He sat. Ruth brought him a cup of coffee and a biscuit, then went back to work. Later, Crow found her outside hanging laundry. Danny says you're bossing him around. Danny needs bossing around. He's going to hurt himself. He's restless. He's young. Young people are always restless. Doesn't mean they should get their way. Crow helped her hang a sheet. You ever raise kids, Mrs. Callahan? The question hit harder than Ruth expected. She fumbled with a clothespin, recovered. No, never had the chance. You'd have been good at it. Ruth didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. They finished hanging the laundry in silence. December came with snow. Not much at first, just a dusting that melted by noon. But then it came heavier, and the temperature dropped until the mornings were brutal. The men grumbled constantly. The work got harder. Fence posts froze in the ground. The animals needed more attention. Pipes burst. Ruth went through firewood like water, trying to keep the kitchen warm enough to work in. She also started noticing things. The way Crow's shoulders tensed when he thought no one was looking. The way he'd stand at the edge of the property at dusk, staring at the hills like he was waiting for something that never came. The way he worked himself past exhaustion and then kept going. One night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Ruth found him in the barn, repairing a harness by lamplight. It's past midnight, she said. I noticed. You should sleep. Should. Probably won't. Ruth sat down on a hay bale. Can I ask you something? Depends on the question. Why do you do this? Work yourself half to death for a ranch that barely breaks even. Crow didn't look up from the leather. What else would I do? I don't know. Something easier. There's nothing easier. There's just different kinds of hard. That's not an answer. He set down the harness, met her eyes. My wife used to ask me the same thing. Why stay here? Why keep fighting? Why not sell and move somewhere civilized? He paused. I never had a good answer for her either. What did she do? Stayed anyway, right up until the end. Ruth heard the weight in those words. I'm sorry. Me too. He picked up the harness again. But sorry doesn't change anything. Work does. So I work. And when the work's done? The work's never done, Mrs. Callahan. That's the point. Ruth stood. Get some sleep, Mr. Crow. The work will still be here in the morning. She left him there, bent over leather and lamplight, and wondered if he'd take her advice. Probably not. Christmas came and went without ceremony. Ruth made a better dinner than usual. Roast beef, potatoes, carrots, pie from dried apples. But that was it. No decorations, no songs, no gifts. The men ate, thanked her, and went back to work. Crow gave everyone Christmas afternoon off, which was the closest thing to celebration the ranch saw. Ruth spent the time in her room, mending clothes and trying not to think about Philadelphia, about the boarding house where she used to put up a tree and serve eggnog, about the tenants who'd become almost like family, about how alone she'd been even then. A knock on the door startled her. Mrs. Callahan? It was Tommy. Got something for you. She opened the door. Tommy was holding a small wooden box, rough-carved but solid. Made this for you? For your things. He looked embarrassed. It's not much. Ruth took the box, ran her fingers over the wood. It's perfect. Thank you, Tommy. Figured you could use it. I know the trunk's pretty small. After he left, Ruth sat on her bed and cried. Not from sadness exactly, just from the sudden, overwhelming fact that someone had thought of her, had made something for her, had seen her as worth the effort. It had been a long time since anyone had done that. The new year arrived with a blizzard. It started in the afternoon. A few flakes, nothing serious. By evening, the wind was howling and the snow was coming down so thick Ruth couldn't see the barn from the kitchen window. The men came in early, shaking off snow and swearing. It's bad out there, Dutch said. Crow's bringing the horses into the barn. Wants everyone to stay close to the buildings tonight. Ruth started making extra coffee. If they were going to be stuck inside, they'd need something to do. Dinner was tense. The men kept looking at the windows, watching the storm build. By the time Ruth served the food, the wind was screaming and the whole building was shaking. "How long you think it'll last?" Danny asked. "Could be an hour, could be 3 days," Dutch said. "No way to tell." Harlan shoved back from the table. "Well, I ain't sitting here all night listening to it." "You got somewhere better to be?" Sam asked. "The bunkhouse. I'm going to sleep." "In this?" "You'll freeze before you get there. It's 50 feet. I'll manage." Crow, who'd been quiet, finally spoke. "No one goes outside until this passes. That's an order." Harlan's face went red. "You can't keep us here." "I can, and I will." "You want to risk your life to prove a point? Do it on your own time, not mine." They stared at each other. Finally, Harlan looked away. The men settled in for a long night. Some played cards. Others just sat, staring at nothing. Ruth kept the coffee coming and tried to ignore the sound of the storm. Around midnight, something crashed outside. The whole building shook. "What the hell was that?" Tommy was on his feet. Crow was already at the door, pulling it open. The wind nearly tore it from his hands. Snow and cold air blasted into the room. Through the white, Ruth could just make out a shape, something dark and broken. "The barn," Crow said. "Part of the roof's gone." "The horses, I'll get them." He was already pulling on his coat. "You can't go out in that," Dutch said. "You'll die. And if I don't, the horses will." Crow looked around the room. "I need 2 men, volunteers only." Sam stepped forward. So did Tommy. "The rest of you stay here. If we're not back in 20 minutes, don't come looking. Understood?" They disappeared into the white. Ruth stood at the window, watching the storm swallow them whole. 20 minutes. She counted every one. 15 minutes in, Harlan started pacing. "They should be back by now." "It's only been 15 minutes, Dutch said. "That's too long." Crow said 20. "Crow doesn't know everything." Ruth turned from the window. "Sit down, Harlan. Don't tell me what to—" "Sit down." Her voice was hard enough that he actually did it. "They're doing what needs doing. We wait. That's all we can do." 19 minutes. Ruth's hands were gripping the windowsill so hard they hurt. Then the door crashed open and 3 men stumbled in, covered in snow, gasping. Behind them, the horses. All of them. Crow, Sam, and Tommy had brought every single horse into the main house. The room erupted in chaos. Men scrambling to clear space. Horses snorting and stamping, terrified but alive. Ruth grabbed blankets, started rubbing down the nearest animal, trying to get it warm. Crow was bent over, coughing. His face was white with cold. "You're an idiot," Ruth told him. "Probably." He straightened, looked around at the chaos. "But they're alive." And they were. All of them. Packed into the main room like the world's strangest barn, but alive. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of men and horses crammed together in spaces too small. 3 days of Ruth cooking in shifts, rationing supplies, trying to keep everyone fed. 3 days of tension and fear and the constant howl of wind. On the second day, one of the horses got spooked and kicked Danny's bad leg. The kid went down screaming. Crow checked it, declared it not rebroken, but badly bruised. "You've got to be kidding me," Danny gasped. "Could be worse," Crow said. "Could have broken it again." "How is that supposed to make me feel better?" "It's not. It's supposed to make you grateful." Ruth brought Danny willow bark tea for the pain and extra blankets for the cold. The kid was crying, trying to hide it. "It's okay to hurt," she told him quietly. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're hurt and scared and stuck in a room full of horses." "But you're alive. Hold on to that." He nodded, wiping his eyes. On the third day, the wind finally stopped. The men opened the door to find the world buried in white. The barn's roof was completely gone. Fences were down. The whole ranch looked like a disaster, but they'd all survived. Crow stood in the doorway, surveying the damage, and Ruth saw something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not defeat, but close. "We'll rebuild," Dutch said quietly. "With what money?" Crow's voice was flat. "That roof was barely holding together as it was. Now it's gone. We don't have the timber to replace it. We don't have the cash to buy more. We'll figure something out." "Yeah." Crow turned away. We always do. But he didn't sound convinced. That night, after the men had cleared the horses back to what was left of the barn, after dinner was done and the dishes washed, Ruth found Crow sitting alone in the dark. She didn't say anything, just sat down beside him. After a long silence, he spoke. I'm going to lose this place. Ruth waited. Every year, it gets harder. Every winter, something breaks. I fix it, but it costs. And we're already running on scraps. This storm, it might be the thing that finally does it. You don't know that. I know the numbers, Mrs. Callahan, and the numbers don't lie. Numbers don't tell the whole story either. He looked at her. What story do you see? I see 15 men who didn't give up during that storm. I see horses that are still alive because you risked your life. I see a ranch that survived worse than a broken roof. Surviving isn't the same as winning. No, but it's not the same as losing either. Crow was quiet for a long moment. Why are you still here? What? You could leave. Go somewhere warmer, easier. Find a job that doesn't require you to wake up at 3 in the morning and work until you can't stand. So why stay? Ruth thought about that. About Philadelphia, about Samuel Pritchard, about all the ways she'd been told she wasn't enough. Because this is the first place that didn't throw me away, she said finally, and I'm not ready to throw it away either. He nodded slowly. Even if it's falling apart? Especially then. That's when it needs people most. They sat in the dark, not talking, just being. And for the first time since the storm hit, Ruth felt like maybe they'd survived this too. They had to. There wasn't any other option. The week after the storm felt like digging out of a grave. Every morning brought new problems. The barn roof wasn't just damaged, it was gone, scattered across 3 acres in pieces too small to salvage. The fences they'd spent months repairing were buried or broken. 2 of the water troughs had cracked from the cold, and the supplies they'd burned through during those 3 days trapped inside meant they were running dangerously low on everything. Ruth rationed what she could. Smaller portions, less coffee. Bread stretched with more water, less flour. The men noticed but didn't complain, which somehow made it worse. Complaints she could handle. Silence meant they were scared. Crow spent every daylight hour in the barn trying to rig a temporary cover with whatever scraps he could find. It wasn't enough. The horses were exposed to the elements, and another storm would finish what the first one started. We need lumber, Tommy said one morning, stating the obvious. We need money for lumber, Dutch corrected, which we don't have. So what do we do? No one had an answer. Ruth was scrubbing pots when Harlan walked into the kitchen. He stood there for a moment, which was unusual. Harlan didn't linger. Something you need? Ruth asked without looking up. Yeah. Shifted his weight. I'm leaving. Ruth's hand stilled in the water. When? End of the week. Told Crow this morning. You take it well? About as well as you'd expect. Didn't try to stop me if that's what you're asking. Harlan pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. Look, I know we haven't exactly been friends. That's putting it kindly. Yeah. Well, point is, I'm not leaving because of you, or because I'm scared. I'm leaving because this place is dying, and I'm not going down with it. Ruth turned to face him. You think it's dying? I think it's been dying for a while. Storm just sped things up. He met her eyes. You should leave too, before it gets worse. And go where? Anywhere. You're a decent cook. You could find work in Carson City, maybe even Sacramento, somewhere that's not held together with spit and prayers. Ruth dried her hands. I appreciate the advice. But you're not taking it. No. Harlan shook his head. You're tougher than you look, Mrs. Callahan. Also dumber, but mostly tougher. He stood. Good luck. You're going to need it. After he left, Ruth stood in the empty kitchen and wondered if he was right. Maybe she was being stupid. Maybe she should cut her losses and leave before the whole thing collapsed. But then she thought about Crow, working himself to exhaustion trying to save something that might already be lost. Thought about Tommy and Sam and Danny and all the others who hadn't left, who were still here because they believed in something, even if they couldn't name it. And she thought about herself, about being thrown away, discarded, told she wasn't worth the trouble. If she left now, she'd be proving them right. So she stayed. By mid-January, Harlan was gone and 2 more men had followed. The ranch was down to 12 hands, which wasn't enough. Not even close. The work that had been brutal before became impossible. Crow started taking on jobs himself that he should have delegated. Ruth would see him up before dawn, working past dark, moving like a man possessed. He lost weight. His face took on a gray, drawn quality. And when she tried to talk to him, he'd just nod and keep moving. "He's going to kill himself," Dutch said one night. They were sitting in the kitchen, Ruth, Dutch, Tommy, and Sam. Everyone else had gone to bed. "Someone needs to talk to him," Tommy said. "He won't listen," Sam said. "You know how he is?" They all looked at Ruth. "Oh no," she said. "He doesn't listen to me either." "He listens to you more than anyone else," Dutch said. "We've all seen it." "That's not saying much." "Mrs. Callahan," Dutch leaned forward. "He respects you. I don't know why, but he does. If anyone can get through to him, it's you." Ruth wanted to argue, but she knew they were right. Crow did listen to her, in his way. Not because she was special, but because she'd proven she could take it, and maybe because she didn't need anything from him except to be left alone to work. "I'll try," she said finally, "but I'm not promising anything." She found him the next morning before dawn, already in the barn, mucking out stalls by lamplight. "You're up early," he said without looking at her. "So are you. Seems to be a pattern." "Work doesn't do itself." Ruth picked up a pitchfork. "Then let me help." "You've got your own work." "Bread can wait. This can't." She started on the next stall. They worked in silence for a while, the only sound the scrape of tools against wood and the quiet breathing of horses. Finally, Crow spoke. "You didn't come out here to shovel horse shit." "No." "So what do you want?" Ruth leaned on her pitchfork. "I want you to stop trying to do everything yourself. Someone has to." "Why does it have to be you?" "Because it's my ranch. My responsibility." "Your ranch is going to be your grave if you keep this up." Ruth's voice was harder than she intended. "You're working yourself to death. And for what? So you can say you tried?" Crow threw down his shovel. "What else am I supposed to do? We're barely hanging on. Every day something else breaks, someone else leaves. I can't afford to hire more men. I can't afford to fix what's broken. All I can do is work harder and hope it's enough." "And when you collapse? When you work yourself into the ground and there's no one left to run this place? Then what?" "Then I guess it dies. Just like everyone keeps telling me it will." Ruth stepped closer. "You want to give up? Fine. Sell the ranch. Walk away. But don't kill yourself pretending you're fighting when you've already surrendered." The words hit harder than she meant them to. Crow's face went white, then red. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I? I watched my mother work herself to death trying to keep our family afloat after my father left. Watched her get thinner and sicker and more desperate until there was nothing left. And you know what she got for it? A grave and a pile of debts. That what you want? That's different." "How? How is it different?" Crow didn't answer. He just stood there, breathing hard, fists clenched. Ruth's voice softened. "You can't save this place alone. You need help, real help, and that means letting other people carry some of the weight." "I don't know how to do that." "Then learn, because right now you're drowning, and you're going to take everyone else down with you." She left him standing there and went back to the kitchen. Her hands were shaking. She'd never talked to anyone like that, never pushed that hard. But she meant every word. The ranch was dying, and if Crow didn't change something, it would take him with it. That afternoon, Crow called a meeting. All the men gathered in the main room, looking wary. Meetings meant bad news. Crow stood at the front, and Ruth could see the exhaustion in every line of his body. "I'm going to be straight with you," he said. "We're in trouble. Money's running out. Supplies are low. We lost 3 men this month, and we can't replace them. And if something else breaks, I don't know how we'll fix it." The room was silent. "So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to Carson City tomorrow to see about a loan. It's a long shot, but it's all I've got. While I'm gone, Dutch is in charge of the work crews. Mrs. Callahan is in charge of supplies and rationing. You do what they tell you. No arguments." "How long will you be gone?" Sam asked. 3 days? Maybe 4? Depends on how fast I can find someone stupid enough to lend me money." He looked around the room. "I know this isn't what any of you signed up for. If you want to leave, I won't hold it against you. But if you stay, I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Slowly, the men nodded. "Good. Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." They filed out, leaving Ruth and Crow alone. "You didn't have to do that," Ruth said. "Yeah, I did. You were right. I can't do this alone." "So you're actually going to let people help?" "I'm going to try." He looked at her. "Think you can keep this place running for a few days?" "I've been keeping it running for months. A few more days won't kill me." "That's what I'm counting on." Crow left before dawn the next morning, taking one of the horses and a pack of supplies. Ruth watched him go from the kitchen window, then turned back to the work at hand. Running the ranch without Crow was harder than she expected. Not because the men didn't listen to her, they did mostly, but because every decision felt enormous. How much grain to give the horses, whether to fix the broken fence or wait, how to stretch the food supplies without anyone going hungry. Dutch helped, which made it bearable. "You're doing fine," he told her on the second day when she was ready to tear her hair out. "I'm guessing." "We're all guessing. That's what running a ranch is. Educated guessing and hoping you're not wrong." "What if I am wrong?" "Then we adjust. That's all you can do." On the third day, the wind picked up. It started as a breeze, nothing serious. By noon, it was stronger. By mid-afternoon, the sky had turned a sickly yellow-brown, and the air tasted like dirt. "Storm coming," Tommy said, squinting at the horizon. "How bad?" Ruth asked. "Bad enough." "Dust storm. They don't last long, but they're hell while they're here." "What do we need to do?" "Get everything inside, animals, tools, anything that can blow away, and seal the buildings as best we can. This stuff gets into everything." They worked fast. The men brought the horses into the barn, what was left of it. Ruth helped secure the chickens, then started stuffing rags into the gaps around the kitchen windows and doors. By the time the storm hit, the world had turned brown. The dust came in a wall, blotting out the sun. The wind screamed. Ruth could hear things banging against the buildings, could feel the whole structure shaking. She'd lived through the blizzard, but this was different. This felt like the land itself was trying to erase them. The men huddled in the main room. Ruth kept the coffee coming and tried to stay calm, but her heart was hammering. "How long do these usually last?" she asked Dutch. "Few hours, sometimes longer." "And then what?" "Then we dig out and hope nothing's too damaged." But an hour in, Danny started coughing. Then Sam. Then 3 more men. The dust was getting inside despite their efforts, and it was getting into their lungs. Ruth tore strips of cloth, soaked them in water, handed them out. "Breathe through these. It'll help." It helped, but not enough. By the second hour, half the men were struggling. The air in the room was thick and brown, and Ruth could barely see across the space. "We need to get out of here," Tommy said, gasping. "We can't," Dutch said. "Storm's still going." "We can't breathe in here either." Ruth looked around the room at the men. Some of them bent over, coughing so hard they couldn't speak. Danny's face was gray. Sam was wheezing. They were going to die in here if she didn't do something. "The root cellar," she said suddenly. Everyone looked at her. "The root cellar under the kitchen. It's underground. The air might be better." "It's tiny," Dutch said. "We won't all fit." "Then we take the worst ones first. Come on." She led Danny, Sam, and 2 others into the kitchen, opened the trapdoor to the cellar. It was small and dark, and smelled like earth and old vegetables, but the air was clearer. "Get down there. Stay until I come get you." "What about you?" Danny asked. "I'll manage. Go." They climbed down. Ruth closed the door, went back for more men. It took 3 trips, but she got the sickest ones into the cellar. The rest stayed in the main room with wet cloths over their faces, waiting for the storm to pass. Ruth moved between the 2 groups, checking on everyone, bringing water, trying to keep people calm, even though she was terrified. 4 hours in, a loud crash shook the building. Something had hit hard. "What was that?" Tommy shouted over the wind. Ruth ran to the window, tried to see through the brown haze. Nothing. Just dust and darkness. Then she saw it. Part of the barn's temporary roof had torn loose and was tumbling across the yard like paper. As she watched, it slammed into the side of the bunkhouse. "The bunkhouse is hit," she said. "How bad?" "I can't tell," Dutch swore. "If that wall comes down, everything in there is gone. Clothes, bedding, everything." Ruth made a decision. "I'm going to check." "Are you insane? You'll die out there." "And if the wall collapses, we lose everything. I'll be fast." Before anyone could stop her, Ruth wrapped a cloth around her face, pulled her shawl tight, and opened the door. The wind hit her like a fist. She could barely see, barely breathe. The dust stung her eyes and got into her nose and mouth despite the cloth. But she pushed forward, one hand on the wall to keep her bearings. The bunkhouse was maybe 30 feet away. It felt like miles. When she finally reached it, she could see the damage. The roof timber had punched through the wall, leaving a gaping hole. Wind and dust were pouring inside. Ruth climbed through the hole, coughing and half blind. Inside was chaos. Bedding scattered, clothes everywhere, the whole structure groaning under the assault. She grabbed what she could, blankets, coats, boots, shoved them into a sack she found hanging on a nail. The building was shaking. Something overhead cracked ominously. Ruth grabbed one more load and scrambled back through the hole. The return trip was worse. She was carrying too much, couldn't move as fast. The wind kept trying to tear the sack from her hands. She slipped twice, went down hard on her knees, got back up. When she finally stumbled through the kitchen door, Dutch and Tommy pulled her inside. "You stupid, crazy woman," Dutch said, but his voice shook with relief. Ruth dropped the sack, yanked the cloth from her face, coughed until she thought her lungs would come up. When she could finally speak, all she said was, "There's more. I need to go back." "Like hell you do. Those men need their things. I'm going." She went back twice more before Dutch physically blocked the door. "Enough. You've done enough." Ruth wanted to argue, but she was shaking so hard she could barely stand. Tommy wrapped a blanket around her and made her sit. The storm finally broke around dusk. The wind died. The dust settled, and when Ruth opened the door, the world outside looked like it had been dipped in brown. Everything was covered, the buildings, the ground, the animals. It would take days to clean up. But they were alive. The men emerged from the cellar, coughing and shaken, but whole. They looked at the sacks Ruth had saved from the bunkhouse, at the woman who'd risked her life to get them. Sam spoke first. "Thank you." Then Danny. "Thank you, Mrs. Callahan." One by one, they all said it, even the ones who'd never thanked her for anything. Ruth nodded, too tired to speak. Dutch put a hand on her shoulder. "You saved more than clothes today. You know that, right?" Ruth didn't know what he meant, but she was too exhausted to ask. That night, she lay in her narrow bed, every muscle aching, lungs still burning from the dust. She'd never been that scared in her life, never pushed herself that hard, never come that close to dying for something that wasn't even hers. But it felt like hers now. The ranch, the men, all of it. Somewhere along the way, she'd stopped being the woman who'd been thrown away and become the woman who held things together. And tomorrow, she'd have to do it all over again. Crow came back on the 5th day, riding in through a landscape that looked like the surface of another planet. Everything was brown. The buildings, the ground, even the sky still had a tinge of it. He dismounted in the yard and just stood there, taking it in. Ruth came out to meet him. She'd done her best to clean up, but there was only so much one person could do. "What happened?" he asked. "Dust storm. Hit 3 days ago. Lasted about 5 hours. Anyone hurt?" "Lots of coughing. Few scrapes. But everyone's alive." Crow's eyes went to the bunkhouse, to the hole in the wall. "What the hell happened there?" "Flying debris. I salvaged what I could." "You went out in the storm." "Someone had to." He stared at her. "You could have been killed." "Could have. Wasn't. That's all that matters." Ruth crossed her arms. "How'd it go in Carson City?" Crow's face went hard. "It didn't. No one's willing to lend money to a failing ranch in the middle of winter. Apparently we're what they call a bad investment. So we're out of options." "Not quite. There's a man willing to buy the place, offered a fair price considering, enough to pay off the debts and give everyone their back wages." Ruth felt something drop in her stomach. "You're selling?" "I don't know yet. I told him I'd think about it." "What's there to think about?" Crow looked at her and she saw something broken in his eyes. "Whether I'm fighting for something worth saving or just too stubborn to admit when I'm beaten." "You want my opinion?" "Not really, but I have a feeling you're going to give it anyway." Ruth stepped closer. "I've been here 5 months. In that time, I've seen this ranch survive a blizzard, a dust storm, and more disasters than I can count. I've seen men leave and others stay. I've seen you work yourself half to death trying to keep it going, and you know what I haven't seen? I haven't seen you quit, not once. Maybe I should. Maybe, but not because some banker in Carson City thinks you're a bad investment. If you sell, do it because you want to, not because you're scared. Crow was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. I told the man I'd give him an answer in 2 weeks. That enough time? For what? To figure out if this place is worth saving. Ruth looked around at the dust-covered ranch, at the broken buildings and exhausted men, at the land that fought them every single day. I already know the answer, she said. Question is whether you do. She left him standing there and went back inside. The next 2 weeks were hell. They cleaned, they repaired, they worked from dawn until they couldn't see anymore, then got up and did it again. Ruth pushed everyone, including herself, harder than she'd ever pushed before, because she'd seen something in Crow's face when he talked about selling. She'd seen surrender, and if he surrendered, it was over, all of it. The men worked without complaint, which told Ruth they understood what was at stake. Even the ones who'd been talking about leaving stayed and put in the hours. On the 10th day, Webb showed up with a wagon full of supplies. What's this? Ruth asked. Delivery. From the general store in Salvation Point. We didn't order anything. Webb handed her a slip of paper. On it, someone had written, for the ranch, paid in full. Who paid for this? Ruth asked. No idea. Man came in, paid cash, said to deliver it to Black Hollow. Didn't give a name. Ruth looked at the supplies, flour, coffee, cornmeal, dried beans, salt, enough to get them through at least another month. Did you see what he looked like? Older guy, maybe 60. Had a beard going white. That's all I remember. Ruth felt something catch in her throat. Samuel Pritchard. The man who'd thrown her away was now paying for supplies for the ranch where she'd landed. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Tell him thank you, she said finally. If you see him again, will do. After Webb left, Ruth stood in the kitchen staring at the supplies and trying to understand. Maybe Pritchard felt guilty. Maybe he'd heard about the storms and felt responsible somehow. Maybe he was just a man trying to make up for being cruel. It didn't matter. What mattered was they had food, they had time, they had a chance. She told Crow that night. Pritchard? He looked stunned. The man who sent you packing? The same. Why would he do that? I don't know, and I don't care. We needed help. We got it. That's enough. Crow nodded slowly. It buys us time. Maybe enough. Enough for what? To prove we're worth saving. The 13th day, Ruth woke to find the men already working. Not because they had to, it was barely dawn, but because they wanted to. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched them. Tommy repairing the fence, Dutch mucking out stalls, Sam fixing a broken gate, Danny still limping, organizing tools. They were fighting for this place. All of them. Because somewhere along the way, Black Hollow had stopped being just a ranch and had become something else. Something worth the pain. On the 14th day, Crow gathered everyone together. I've made a decision, he said. The men waited. I'm not selling. This ranch has been in my family for 20 years. It's where I buried my wife and daughter. It's where I've put every ounce of strength I have. And I'll be damned if I let some banker take it because we had a bad winter. A few of the men smiled. Ruth felt something loosen in her chest. But I can't do this alone. I've been trying to, and it nearly killed me. So here's the deal. We're going to run this place differently. Everyone gets a say in decisions. Everyone carries the weight, and everyone gets a share of the profits when we turn this around. What profits? Someone called out. Crow grinned. It was the first time Ruth had seen him smile in months. The ones we're going to make, starting now. The room erupted in cheers. Ruth slipped out during the celebration and went to the kitchen. She had work to do, always work to do. But for the first time since she'd arrived, it felt like the work meant something. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. Crow stood in the doorway. Thank you, he said. For what? For not letting me quit. For pushing when I needed pushing. For caring about this place when you didn't have to. Ruth shrugged. Someone had to. It didn't have to be you. Yes, it did. She met his eyes. Because this is my home now, and you don't give up on home. Crow nodded. No, you don't. He left and Ruth went back to work, a small smile on her face. The ranch was still standing, still fighting, and so was she. Spring came late that year, creeping in like it wasn't sure it was welcome. The first sign was the ice breaking up in the water troughs. Then the mud, thick, sucking mud that made every step an ordeal. Then finally, impossibly, a few stubborn shoots of green pushing through the brown earth near the barn. Ruth saw them one morning and stopped dead in her tracks. She'd been at Black Hollow for 7 months, and this was the first time she'd seen the land offer anything that wasn't punishment. Pretty, aren't they? She turned. Crow was standing behind her, coffee cup in hand, looking at the same patch of green. I'd forgotten things could grow here, Ruth said. They can, just takes longer than anywhere else. He took a sip of coffee. Garden should go in next week. You up for it? Me? You're the one who knows about vegetables. I just know about cattle and bad decisions. Ruth smiled despite herself. I'll see what I can do. The garden became hers by default. None of the men wanted to deal with it, and Ruth found she didn't mind. After months of cooking whatever scraps they had, the idea of fresh vegetables felt like luxury. She started planning. Potatoes, carrots, onions, beans, things that would keep and stretch. Maybe some lettuce if she could protect it from the wind. Tomatoes were risky this far out, but she'd try anyway. Tommy helped her turn the soil. It was hard work. The ground didn't want to give, but eventually they broke through to something that looked like it might support life. My ma used to have a garden, Tommy said, leaning on his shovel. Back in Missouri, she could grow anything. Roses, vegetables, even got an apple tree to take once. You miss her? Every day. She died when I was 15, cholera. He wiped sweat from his face. After that, it was just me and my pa. He wasn't much for talking, sent me west when I turned 17, said there was nothing for me there. Ruth planted a row of seed potatoes. You ever think about going back? Sometimes, but then I think, going back to what? The farm's probably gone. Pa too, most likely. This is home now, for better or worse. Worse mostly, Ruth said. Tommy laughed. Yeah, but the worst parts make the better parts count for something. They worked until the sun started climbing, then Ruth went back to prepare breakfast. The kitchen felt different now, less like a prison, more like the center of something. The men came through 3 times a day, and Ruth had learned all their rhythms. Who liked their eggs runny, who wanted extra coffee, who'd eat anything you put in front of them without complaint. She'd also learned that feeding people was a kind of power. Not the obvious kind, not orders or authority, but something quieter. The men needed her. And slowly they'd stopped resenting that fact and started respecting it. Even the new hires treated her differently than they'd treated the cooks before her. Word had spread about the dust storm, about Ruth going into the bunkhouse while the world tried to tear itself apart. Men talked, and stories grew in the telling, and now Ruth was the woman who'd saved their belongings, who'd kept everyone breathing when the air turned to poison. She didn't correct the exaggerations. Let them think what they wanted. As long as they showed up for meals and did their work, the rest didn't matter. What mattered was that Black Hollow was still standing, still fighting. The first calf of spring was born on a Tuesday. Ruth heard the commotion from the kitchen and went to investigate. The men were gathered around one of the cows in the barn, and there it was, wet and wobbly and impossibly small. It's a bull, Dutch announced. Good strong one, too. The men were grinning like idiots. After losing so much over the winter, this felt like a victory. Crow stood off to the side, watching. His face was carefully neutral, but Ruth saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Hope, maybe. Or just the memory of what hope felt like. Going to name it? Sam asked. No point, Crow said. It's livestock, not a pet. But Ruth noticed he stayed in the barn long after everyone else left, watching the calf try to stand, making sure it was feeding properly. That night, after dinner, Ruth found him sitting on the porch of the main house, staring at the hills. You can admit you're happy about the calf, she said. I'm not happy. I'm cautious. Same thing for you. Crow almost smiled. Maybe. Ruth sat down beside him. The evening was cool but not cold, and the sky was doing that thing it sometimes did out here, turning colors that didn't seem possible. Purple and orange and red all bleeding together. Can I ask you something? Ruth said. Depends. Your wife and daughter, what were they like? Crow was quiet for so long Ruth thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he spoke, his voice rough. Anna was tough. Tougher than me, truth be told. She came out here when this place was nothing but dirt and dreams, and she never complained. Not once. She just worked. He paused. Sarah was 4 when the fever took her. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's stubbornness. Used to follow me around the ranch, asking 1,000 questions about everything. I'm sorry. Me too. He looked at Ruth. It's been 5 years. Most days I'm fine. But then something happens. A calf is born. Spring comes. Something small. And I remember what it was like when they were here. And it hurts all over again. Ruth understood that. The way grief could ambush you, the way happiness and pain could exist in the same moment. They'd be proud of you, she said quietly, for not giving up. You don't know that. I know Anna came out here when this place was nothing. That means she believed in it, in you. That doesn't just go away because she's gone. Crow nodded, not trusting himself to speak. They sat in silence as the sky darkened and the first stars came out. By mid-April, the garden was showing real progress. The potatoes were coming up strong. The carrots had sprouted. Even the tomatoes were hanging on, protected by a makeshift windbreak Tommy had built. Ruth spent her afternoons there when she could, weeding and watering and watching things grow. It was the first time since Philadelphia that she'd felt like she was building something instead of just surviving it. One afternoon, she looked up to find a woman standing at the edge of the garden. She was maybe 30, dressed in trail clothes with dark hair pulled back and eyes that missed nothing. Help you? Ruth asked. I'm looking for Ethan Crow. They told me in town he runs this place. He does. He's out with the cattle right now. Should be back by dinner. The woman looked around, taking in the ranch with an appraising eye. You the cook? Among other things. I'm looking for work. I can handle horses, mend fences, do pretty much anything that needs doing. Ruth stood, brushing dirt from her hands. We're not hiring. Money's tight. I heard. I also heard you lost 3 men over the winter and you're working short-handed. Who told you that? Word travels, so do I. The woman met Ruth's eyes. Name's Catherine Reeves. I've worked ranches from here to Montana. I'm good at what I do, I don't complain, and I work cheap. That enough for you? Ruth studied her. There was something familiar in the way Catherine held herself, like she'd learned not to expect anything from anyone and had gotten comfortable with that fact. Wait here. I'll get Mr. Crow. She found him near the barn and explained the situation. Crow's first reaction was to say no. They couldn't afford another hand, woman or not. But Ruth saw him thinking about the work that needed doing, the fences that still needed repair, the dozen tasks they were behind on. I'll talk to her, he said finally. Ruth went back to the garden while Crow interviewed Catherine. She tried not to listen, but voices carried out here, and she caught pieces. Catherine was from Wyoming originally. Her family had lost their ranch 2 years ago. She'd been working her way south ever since, taking whatever job she could find. After 20 minutes, Crow came to find Ruth. I'm going to try her out, week's trial. If she can do the work, she stays. And the money? We'll figure it out, same as we always do. Catherine moved into the bunkhouse that evening. The men eyed her warily. A woman in their space was new, but Catherine didn't seem bothered. She claimed a bunk, stowed her gear, and showed up for dinner like she'd been there for months. Food's good, she said to Ruth afterward. It's better than it was. I heard about that too. Heard you nearly killed everyone with bad beef your first month. Ruth felt her face heat. Who the hell told you that? The kid, Tommy. He thinks it's funny. Catherine smiled. Don't worry, everyone screws up their first month. If they didn't, they wouldn't be human. Over the next few days, Catherine proved she knew what she was doing. She could ride better than half the men, fix a fence faster than anyone, and handle the more difficult horses without breaking a sweat. By the end of the week, even the skeptics were convinced. She's good, Dutch admitted to Ruth. Shame we can't afford to keep her. But Crow did keep her. He shuffled the budget, cut corners elsewhere, and made it work. Because Catherine was filling gaps they'd been ignoring, and the ranch was better for it. Ruth found herself grateful for another woman on the property. They didn't become friends exactly. Catherine was too private for that. But they developed an understanding. 2 women in a man's world, both fighting to prove they belonged. One evening, Catherine found Ruth in the kitchen after everyone else had gone to bed. Can I ask you something? Sure, Ruth said. Why are you here? I mean, really here. You could be working in a town somewhere. Easier work, better pay. So why stay? Ruth thought about how to answer that. Because I didn't have anywhere else to go. And because somewhere along the way,
this became home. Even though it's falling apart?
Especially because it's falling apart. Things that are perfect don't need you. This place needs everyone who's willing to fight for it. Catherine nodded slowly. I get that. I've been looking for something worth fighting for since I lost my family's ranch. Maybe this is it. Maybe, Ruth said. Give it time. You'll figure out if it's worth staying. How long did it take you? Ruth smiled. About 3 months and a dust storm. May brought the cattle drive. Every spring, Crow sold off some of the herd to a buyer in Carson City. It was how they made most of their money for the year, and this year they needed every penny. The plan was to move 50 head, not a huge drive, but enough to require most of the hands. They'd be gone for a week, maybe longer, which meant Ruth and Catherine would be holding down the ranch with just 2 men, an older hand named Walter, who was too stiff for trail work, and Danny, whose leg still wasn't strong enough for long rides. You'll be all right? Crow asked Ruth the night before they left. We'll manage. It's just a week. A lot can go wrong in a week.
A lot can go wrong in a day. We've survived worse. Crow looked like he wanted to say something else, but didn't. Finally, he just nodded. If there's trouble, send Walter to town. Don't try to handle it yourself. Yes, boss, Ruth said, the corner of her mouth quirking up. He almost smiled. I'm serious, Mrs. Callahan. So am I. The next morning, the men left with the cattle, a cloud of dust marking their progress until they disappeared over the hills. Ruth stood in the yard watching them go and felt the weight of the ranch settle onto her shoulders. The first 2 days were quiet. Ruth and Catherine split the work, feeding the remaining animals, maintaining the buildings, keeping the garden watered. Danny helped where he could, and Walter did what his aging body would allow. On the 3rd day, a group of riders appeared on the road. Ruth saw them from the kitchen window, 4 men on horseback, moving slow and deliberate. They didn't look like drovers or ranchers. They looked like trouble. Catherine, Ruth called. Catherine appeared in the doorway, took one look at the riders, and swore. You know them? No, but I know the type. The men rode into the yard and dismounted. The leader was tall and lean, with a scar running down his cheek and eyes like dirty ice. This Black Hollow Ranch? He asked. It is, Ruth said, stepping onto the porch. Can I help you? Looking for Ethan Crow. He's not here. When's he coming back? Few days. What's this about? The man smiled, and it wasn't friendly. We're associates of a man Crow borrowed money from last year, came to collect. Ruth's stomach dropped. He doesn't owe anyone money. That's not what our employer says. It says Crow's 3 months behind on payments. We're here to settle the account. I told you he's not here. You'll have to come back. The man looked around the yard, at the buildings, at the horses in the corral. Nice place. Be a shame if something happened to it while Crow was gone. Catherine stepped out onto the porch, holding a rifle. You threatening us? The man's smile widened. Just making an observation. Observe somewhere else. You're not welcome here. For a moment, Ruth thought it was going to turn ugly. The 4 men looked at Catherine, at the rifle, at the near-empty ranch. They were calculating odds, weighing whether it was worth the fight. Then the leader tipped his hat. We'll be back. Tell Crow he's got 1 week to settle up. After that, we start taking payment in assets. They mounted up and rode out, taking their time, making sure Ruth and Catherine understood the threat. After they were gone, Ruth sat down hard on the porch steps. You all right? Catherine asked. No, those men. They're going to come back, and when they do, we'll deal with it. Catherine set the rifle aside. Does Crow actually owe them money? I have no idea. He never mentioned it. Then maybe it's a bluff. Maybe they heard the boss was gone and figured they'd try to shake something loose. Or maybe he borrowed money we don't know about and forgot to mention it. Catherine sat down beside her. Either way, we've got a week. That's enough time to figure something out. Ruth wanted to believe her, but the look in that man's eyes hadn't been a bluff. It had been a promise. She sent Walter to town the next morning with a message for Crow. Wherever he was on the trail, he needed to know what was waiting for him when he got back. The days crawled by. Ruth kept working, cooking, cleaning, tending the garden, but her mind was elsewhere. She kept seeing those 4 men riding into the yard, kept hearing the threat in their voices. On the 6th day, Crow and the others returned. They looked exhausted and dusty, and thoroughly used up, but they were grinning.
The sale had gone well, better than expected. They had money, real money, enough to cover supplies and wages, and maybe even start on some repairs. Ruth met Crow in the yard. "We need to talk." His smile faded. "What happened?" She told him about the riders, about the threats, about the debt they claimed he owed. Crow's face went hard. "Son of a bitch. So it's real? You do owe them?"
I borrowed money last year, saw a small amount just to get through a rough patch. I paid it back. Or I thought I did. He rubbed his face. The man I borrowed from died over the winter. His son took over the business. Maybe he's looking at old books trying to squeeze every penny. Or maybe this is just extortion. Either way, they're coming back. They gave you a week. When? 2 days ago, so you've got 5 days left. Crow swore again. How many were there?
4. Armed. They looked like they knew how to use them. He was already moving toward the house. "Dutch, Tommy, Sam, inside, now." The men gathered in the main room while Crow explained the situation. Ruth watched their faces shift from confusion to anger to determination. "So what do we do?" Sam asked. "We don't pay," Crow said flatly. "I don't owe them anything. And even if I did, we don't negotiate with men who threaten women and try to shake down an empty ranch." "They'll come back," Dutch said. "I know, and when they do, we'll be ready." The next 4 days were tense. The men took shifts watching the road. Catherine kept her rifle close. Ruth went about her work but jumped at every sound. On the 5th day, the riders returned. This time, there were 6 of them. Crow met them in the yard, flanked by Dutch and Tommy. Sam and Catherine were positioned near the barn, out of direct sight but with clear shots if things went bad. Ruth watched from the kitchen window, her heart hammering. "You got my message?" the scarred man asked. "I got it, and here's my answer. I don't owe you anything." "That's not what the books say." "Then the books are wrong. I paid your boss in full before he died. If his son's got a problem with that, he can take it up with me in person, not send hired muscle to threaten my people." The man leaned forward in his saddle. "You sure you want to play it this way?" "I'm sure I want you off my property, now." For a moment, nobody moved. The air felt electric, like the moment before lightning strikes. Then one of the other riders reached for his gun. He didn't get it clear before Catherine's rifle cracked. The shot went high, deliberately high, but it sent the man's horse skittering sideways. "Next one's lower," Catherine called out. The scarred man looked at her, then at Crow, then at the ranch buildings where he knew more men were waiting. He was outnumbered and outgunned, and he knew it. "This isn't over," he said. "Yeah, it is," Crow said. "You come back here again, you won't ride out. That clear enough for you?" The man's jaw tightened, but he nodded to his men. They turned their horses and left, slower this time, like leaving was their idea. Ruth didn't breathe until they were out of sight. When Crow came inside, she was shaking. "You all right?" he asked. "I think so. Are they really gone?" "For now, maybe for good. Men like that don't like long fights. They want easy money. We just proved we're not easy." Ruth sat down. "What if they come back with more men?" "Then we deal with it. Same as we deal with everything else." He looked at her, and something in his expression softened. "You did good, Ruth. Holding things together while we were gone. Not panicking when they showed up." It was the first time he'd called her Ruth instead of Mrs. Callahan. She felt something shift between them, something that had been building for months but neither of them had acknowledged. "Someone had to," she said quietly. "It didn't have to be you." "Yes, it did, because this is my home too." Crow held her gaze for a long moment, then he nodded. "Yeah, it is." After he left, Ruth sat alone in the kitchen, listening to the ranch settle around her. The men's voices in the bunkhouse, the horses moving in the barn, the wind in the eaves. 7 months ago, she'd been standing in the dust, abandoned and alone, with no idea how she'd survived the night. Now she was sitting in a kitchen she'd defended, on a ranch she'd helped save, surrounded by people who'd become something like family. She'd done more than survive. She'd become necessary, valued, seen. And for the first time in her life, Ruth Callahan understood what it meant to be home. Summer came hard and fast, the way it always did in this part of the country. The temperatures climbed until the days felt like standing inside an oven, and the work got meaner. Ruth adjusted, started cooking earlier in the morning when the kitchen was still bearable. shifted the heavy tasks to before dawn or after dusk. The men did the same, working in the margins of the day and hiding from the sun when it peaked. The garden struggled but survived. Ruth watered it every evening, watching her tomatoes finally redden, her beans climb the stakes Tommy had driven into the ground. It wasn't much, but it was something. Fresh vegetables on the table felt like winning. The ranch had settled into a rhythm that felt almost stable. The cattle drive money had bought them breathing room, supplies, repairs, wages paid on time for the first time in months. The men seemed lighter, like they'd stopped waiting for the next disaster and started believing they might actually make it through the year. Even Crow seemed different. He still worked too hard, still pushed himself past reason. But there was something in his face that hadn't been there before. Not quite happiness. Crow didn't do happiness. But maybe its quieter cousin. Contentment, or close enough. Ruth noticed the way he looked at the ranch now, like he was seeing it instead of just surviving it, like he was remembering why he'd fought so hard to keep it. She also noticed the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't paying attention. It made her nervous and warm at the same time, and she didn't know what to do with that feeling, so she ignored it. One evening in late June, Crow found her in the garden after dinner. The sun was setting, painting the hills in shades of gold and amber, and the heat had finally broken enough to breathe. "You've done well with this," he said, gesturing at the plants. "They're not dead yet. That's about all I can claim. It's more than anyone else could have done." He paused, like he was working up to something. "I wanted to thank you for everything, not just the garden, all of it." Ruth kept weeding, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "You already thanked me." "I know, but I don't think I said it right." He crouched down beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him. "When you first got here, I didn't think you'd last a week. Thought you were just another person passing through, running from something. But you stayed, and you didn't just stay, you fought. For this place, for the men, for me when I was too stubborn to fight for myself." Ruth's hands stilled in the dirt. "I didn't have anywhere else to go." "That's not true anymore. You could leave tomorrow and find work anywhere. People know you now. Your reputation." "My reputation?" Word's gotten around. The cook at Black Hollow who can handle anything, who went into a dust storm to save a bunch of ranch hands' belongings, who stood down armed men while the boss was away. He smiled slightly. "You're kind of famous, Ruth." She finally looked at him. "I don't want to be famous. I just want to be useful." "You're more than useful. You're—" He stopped, seemed to reconsider. "You're important. To this place. To me." The air between them felt charged, like before a storm. Ruth stood up, brushing dirt from her hands, needing distance. "Mr. Crow? Ethan, you've been calling me that in your head for months. Might as well say it out loud." Ruth felt her face heat. "How do you know what I call you in my head?" "Because I know you. Better than you think." He stood too, and they were close now, close enough that Ruth could see the flecks of gray in his eyes, the lines around his mouth, the scar on his chin she'd never asked about. "I'm not good at this. Talking about feelings, saying what I mean. Anna used to get so frustrated with me." "Then don't," Ruth said quietly. "Don't say anything you'll regret." "I won't regret this." He reached out, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was so gentle it made Ruth's throat tight. "I'm 52 years old, lost the woman I loved and the daughter I'd have died for. Spent 5 years convincing myself I didn't deserve anything good after that. But then you showed up, and you were tough and stubborn, and you refused to quit. And somewhere along the way, I started thinking maybe I was wrong. Maybe I do deserve something good. Maybe we both do." Ruth couldn't breathe. "Ethan, I'm not asking you for anything. I just wanted you to know, in case you were wondering." He stepped back, giving her space. "Think about it, or don't. Either way, you've got a place here as long as you want it." He walked away, leaving Ruth standing alone in the garden with her heart hammering and her mind racing. She didn't sleep that night, just lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word, every look, trying to figure out what she wanted. She'd spent so much of her life being practical. Marrying for security instead of love, running the boarding house because it was sensible, coming west because she was out of options, staying at Black Hollow because leaving would have meant admitting defeat. But somewhere in the last 8 months, something had shifted. The ranch had stopped being a last resort and had become something she actually cared about. The work had stopped being punishment and had become purpose. And Ethan Crow had stopped being her boss and had become What? A friend? More than that? Ruth didn't know. She'd been alone so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to want someone, to be wanted. The thought terrified her. The next morning, she got up early like always, started the coffee like always, began making breakfast like always. But everything felt different, like the world had tilted slightly and she was trying to find her balance. Ethan came in with the other men, took his coffee, sat in his usual spot. He didn't look at her any differently than he had yesterday, didn't treat her any differently. If anything, he seemed more relaxed, like saying what he'd said had lifted a weight. Ruth served the food and tried to act normal, tried not to notice the way her hands shook when she poured his coffee, tried not to think about the fact that she wanted to walk over and touch his shoulder, his hand, something. After breakfast, Catherine cornered her in the kitchen. All right, what happened? Nothing happened. You're lying. You've got that look. What look? The look women get when a man says something that scrambles their brain. Catherine leaned against the counter. Was it Crow? Ruth scrubbed a pot harder than necessary. I don't want to talk about it. That's a yes. What'd he say? Catherine, come on. I'm the only other woman here. You've got to talk to someone or you'll explode. Ruth set down the pot. He said I was important to him, to the ranch, and he said we both deserved something good. Catherine's eyebrows went up. That's practically a marriage proposal for a man like Crow. Don't be ridiculous. I'm not. I've seen the way he looks at you. Everyone has. Ruth felt her stomach drop. Everyone? Pretty much. The men have been taking bets on when he'd finally say something. Ruth didn't know whether to laugh or die of embarrassment. That's mortifying. That's life on a ranch. There's not much to do except work and gossip. Catherine's expression softened. What do you want, Ruth? Not what's practical or sensible. What do you actually want? Ruth sat down at the table, suddenly exhausted. I don't know. I've spent my whole life doing what made sense. Marrying a man I respected but didn't love because it was secure. Running a boarding house because it was safe. Coming here because I was out of options. I don't know how to want something just because I want it. Then maybe it's time to learn. Catherine poured herself coffee. You've spent 8 months proving you can survive anything. Maybe now you get to figure out what comes after survival. After Catherine left, Ruth sat alone in the kitchen, turning those words over in her mind. What came after survival? She'd been so focused on just making it through each day that she hadn't thought about what came next, hadn't let herself think about it, because thinking about the future meant hoping for things, and hope was dangerous. But maybe Catherine was right. Maybe it was time to stop just surviving and start actually living. The question was, did she have the courage for that? A week passed, then another. Summer deepened and the work continued, and Ruth kept her distance from Ethan even though it hurt. She needed time to think, to figure out what she wanted without the pressure of his presence. But the ranch had other plans. It started with Danny's leg. He'd been favoring it for weeks, insisting it was fine, but Ruth could see it getting worse. Finally, it got bad enough that he couldn't hide it anymore. It's infected, Dutch said, examining the old break site. Looks like something got in there. Maybe when he got kicked during the blizzard. How bad? Ethan asked. Bad enough that he needs a doctor. Real one, not me trying to clean it with whiskey and hope. They sent Danny to Carson City with Tommy. The kid didn't want to go, kept insisting he was fine, but Ethan put his foot down. You lose that leg because you're too stubborn to see a doctor. You're no good to anyone. Go. That's an order. Danny went. 3 days later, Tommy came back alone. Doctor says it's bad. Infection's deep. They're trying to treat it, but... Tommy's voice cracked. He might lose the leg. They don't know yet. The news hit the ranch like a punch. Danny was young, barely 20, and the thought of him losing his leg because of an injury from the blizzard felt wrong. Felt like the land taking one more piece they couldn't afford to give. Ruth threw herself into work, cooking and cleaning and tending the garden, like if she moved fast enough she could outrun the guilt. Because she'd been there when Danny got hurt. She'd seen it happen and hadn't done more to help. Ethan found her in the garden one evening, yanking weeds with enough force to tear them in half. It's not your fault, he said. I didn't say it was. You're thinking it loud enough. He knelt beside her. Danny's injury happened during a crisis. You were trying to keep everyone alive. You did what you could. It wasn't enough. It's never enough. That's what this place teaches you. You can work yourself to death, do everything right, and sometimes it still goes wrong. He reached out, stilled her hands. But that doesn't mean you quit trying. It just means you accept that you're human. Ruth's hands were shaking. I'm tired, Ethan. I'm tired of fighting and losing. Tired of watching people get hurt. Tired of feeling like no matter what I do, it's not enough. I know. I feel that every single day. He pulled her hands away from the weeds, held them in his own. His palms were rough and warm and solid. But you know what else I feel? Grateful. Because you're here. Because you chose to stay when everyone said you should leave. Because you made this place feel like something worth fighting for again. Ruth looked at him, really looked at him, and saw her own exhaustion reflected back, saw the weight he carried, saw the man who'd lost everything and kept going anyway. I don't know how to do this, she whispered. Do what? Care about someone again. Let myself want something. I'm 52 years old. I thought that part of my life was over. Ethan smiled, and it transformed his whole face. I'm 52 too, and I thought the same thing, but maybe we were both wrong. He leaned forward, and Ruth knew what was coming, and she didn't pull away. The kiss was gentle, tentative, like neither of them quite remembered how this worked. It tasted like coffee and dust and hope, and when they pulled apart, Ruth was crying. I'm a mess, she said. So am I. We'll figure it out. They sat in the garden as the sun set, holding hands like teenagers, and Ruth felt something inside her that had been locked tight for years finally start to open. Danny came back 3 weeks later with his leg intact but scarred. The doctor had managed to save it, but he'd be limping for the rest of his life. Could be worse, Danny said, leaning on the crutch Tommy had made for him. Could be dead. Could be legless. This I can work with. The men threw him a welcome back dinner, and Ruth made everything Danny liked. Fried chicken, biscuits, apple pie made from the dried apples they'd been hoarding. It wasn't fancy, but it was made with care, and Danny ate until he couldn't move. I miss this, he said. Missed you, Mrs. Callahan. Missed you too, kid. Now don't do anything stupid for a while, all right? Can't promise that, but I'll try. August brought a letter from Samuel Pritchard. Ruth found it on the kitchen table one morning, her name written in careful script on the envelope. She recognized the handwriting from the letters he'd sent to Philadelphia, back when she'd thought he was offering her a future. She almost threw it away without reading it. But curiosity won. The letter was short. Mrs. Callahan, I heard you're still at Black Hollow Ranch. I also heard what you did during the dust storm and how you've helped keep the place running. I wanted to apologize for how I treated you when you arrived. It was cruel and beneath me. You deserved better. I also wanted to explain the supplies I sent. It wasn't charity. It was an attempt to make amends for my behavior. A poor one, perhaps, but the best I could manage. I hope you've found what you were looking for. S. Pritchard. Ruth read it twice, then set it aside. She'd spent months angry at Pritchard for throwing her away. But reading his words now, she felt something else. Not forgiveness, exactly, but understanding. He'd been scared and foolish, and he'd lashed out at her because she represented a decision he regretted making. She'd done the same thing plenty of times, made choices out of fear, hurt people because she was hurting. The difference was she'd learned from it, and maybe Pritchard had too. She burned the letter in the stove and went back to work. September brought the first hint of fall, a coolness in the morning air, a change in the light. The garden was finishing up, the last of the tomatoes ripening, the beans drying on the vine. Ruth harvested what she could, put up what would keep, and prepared for winter. Everyone was preparing, stacking firewood, repairing the barn roof properly this time, stockpiling supplies. They'd survived one winter by sheer stubbornness. This time, they'd be ready. One evening, Ethan found Ruth on the porch of the main house, watching the sunset. Got something for you, he said. He handed her a folded piece of paper. Ruth opened it and found a deed, a legal document transferring partial ownership of Black Hollow Ranch to her name. She stared at it, not understanding. What is this? It's what it looks like. You're a partner now, equal share in the ranch. Ethan, I can't. You can, and you will. You've earned it, more than earned it. He sat beside her. This place wouldn't exist without you. The men wouldn't have stayed. I wouldn't have kept fighting. You saved this ranch, Ruth. Seems only fair you get a piece of it.
Ruth's hands trembled. This is too much. It's not enough. But it's what I've got to give. He covered her hands with his. I want you to know you belong here. Not as the cook, not as hired help. As an owner. As my partner. In all things, if you'll have me. Ruth looked at him, this man who'd been broken and had put himself back together through sheer force of will. This man who'd given her a chance when no one else would. This man who'd become her home. Yes, she said. Yes to all of it. He pulled her close, and they sat together watching the sun drop behind the hills, turning the sky into a canvas of impossible colors. It wasn't perfect. The ranch was still struggling. Money was still tight. Winter was coming, and it would be brutal like always. There would be more storms, more losses, more fights. But they'd face it together. And that made all the difference. Winter came, as it always did. But this time, Black Hollow Ranch was ready. They'd reinforced the barn, stockpiled supplies, prepared for the worst. And when the first snow fell in November, they watched it from warm buildings with full bellies and quiet confidence. Ruth stood in the kitchen one morning, looking out at the white landscape, and marveled at how different this felt from last year. Last year she'd been terrified, uncertain, fighting for every scrap of respect. This year, she was home. Ethan came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how I got here. About the woman who stepped off that wagon 8 months ago, so scared and desperate she could barely breathe. About everything that's happened since." "Regret any of it?" Ruth leaned back against him. "Not even a little bit." The men came in for breakfast, 12 of them now, since they'd hired 2 more hands with the money from the cattle drive. They filled the kitchen with noise and warmth, and Ruth moved among them, serving food and coffee, listening to their stories, being part of this strange family they'd built from broken pieces. After breakfast, Catherine pulled her aside. "I'm leaving in the spring," she said. Ruth felt her heart sink. "Why?" "Because I found what I came here looking for. A place worth fighting for, people worth staying with. And now I need to go build that for myself." She smiled. "I'm heading north, going to try to buy back my family's ranch. It's a long shot, but you taught me something, Ruth." "What's that?" "That long shots are the only ones worth taking." Ruth hugged her, hard. "You're going to be amazing. I learned from the best." The winter was hard, but they weathered it. The blizzards came, and they hunkered down. The cold bit deep, and they burned through firewood. The work never stopped, and they kept going. And when spring finally came, bringing green shoots and warmer air and the promise of another year, Ruth stood in the garden, her garden, and planted seeds for the future. Ethan found her there, dirt under her fingernails, sun on her face. "Happy?" he asked. Ruth looked around at the ranch, at the buildings they'd repaired, the fences they'd mended, the land they'd fought for. She looked at Ethan, this man who'd become her partner in all the ways that mattered. She looked at herself, this woman who'd been thrown away and had refused to stay discarded. "Yeah," she said, "I think I am." And she meant it, because Ruth Callahan had learned something in the year since that wagon had pulled away and left her standing in the dust. She'd learned that worth wasn't something people gave you. It was something you built piece by piece, day by day, through work and sweat and refusing to quit. She'd learned that home wasn't a place you found. It was something you fought for, something you earned through showing up and staying even when it got hard. She'd learned that being needed was its own kind of love, and sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it was everything. The world had told her she was too old, too worn, too much trouble, had told her she wasn't worth the ink wasted on empty promises. But the world had been wrong, because Ruth Callahan had become exactly what Black Hollow Ranch needed. And in becoming that, she'd found something she'd been searching for her entire life without knowing it. She'd found herself, not the woman people expected her to be, not the woman circumstances had forced her to become, but the woman she'd always had the potential to be if only someone had given her the chance. She'd given herself that chance, and she'd taken it. And in a land that took everything from everyone, Ruth Callahan had become the one thing no one could take away, the one thing that mattered most. She'd become irreplaceable. The garden would grow. The seasons would turn. The ranch would face new challenges, new storms, new battles. Some they'd win, some they'd lose. But they'd face them together, Ruth and Ethan and all the broken, stubborn people who'd found their way to Black Hollow and decided to stay.
And that, Ruth thought, as she planted the last seed and patted the earth down over it, was more than enough. It was everything.